It was late, one of those Tuesday nights where the day hadn't been bad, just long enough to blur together. I was sitting in my car outside my apartment, engine still warm, phone in my hand. Not really sure why I'd opened my bank app. I wasn't worried. I wasn't checking for damage. It felt more like muscle memory. The same way you open the fridge even though you already know what's inside. A list of charges scrolled past. Nothing dramatic. $10. $23. Another small one I didn't recognize right away. Not fraud, not a mistake, just unfamiliar. And that was the strange part. These weren't reckless purchases. They didn't come with stories attached. I couldn't picture where I was or what I was thinking when I made them. They felt weightless, like they belonged to some other version of me who clocked in during tired hours. Sitting there, phone dimming, I realized how much of my money leaves without leaving a memory behind, and that bothered me more than the total ever had. After that, I started paying attention to what I could remember spending money on versus what I couldn't. The stuff I remembered usually had effort baked into it. Planning, waiting, telling myself a whole story about why it made sense. The forgotten spending didn't argue with me at all. It just happened in the background, tucked into busy afternoons and quiet nights when my brain felt full. Looking at my statements, I noticed how quickly my eyes skimmed past those charges, like I was trained not to linger. That's when it clicked that forgetting wasn't random, forgetting was useful. It let the spending keep going without friction. I remember telling myself for years that small stuff didn't matter, that it wasn't worth the mental energy. But sitting there with the list, that belief felt thin, not wrong in a loud way, just incomplete. The discomfort came from realizing how absent I'd been during some of the most consistent spending in my life, and how normal that absence had started to feel. Food was the first place I noticed it happening regularly, not dinners I looked forward to, or meals with people I cared about. Those stuck. I'm talking about the random lunches, the last-minute deliveries, the coffee that quietly turned into a sandwich because I was already there. $8 here, $14 there, nothing that triggered alarm bells. The insight came later, when I tried to picture a specific one of those meals, and came up blank. If I added an extra $12 a day this way, that's around $360 a month. Over a year, more than $4,000. That number didn't feel shocking. It felt hollow. Emotionally, that was worse. It felt like I'd been paying rent for moments I wasn't really present for. I remembered telling myself it was about convenience, about getting through busy days. But looking at the total, it felt less like survival and more like drifting. Subscriptions slipped under my radar in a different way. They don't ask for attention once they're set up. They just exist. Streaming services, apps, storage, tools I thought I'd use more. $5, $10, $15. Each one felt reasonable on its own. The insight landed when I realized how long some of them had been running. Years, in a few cases. When I added them up, it was close to $90 a month. Over $1,000 a year for things I barely thought about. Emotionally, that realization felt oddly personal. Like I'd been maintaining quiet obligations I didn't remember agreeing to anymore. I remembered how intentional each sign-up felt at the beginning. Each one had a reason, future value, convenience. Somewhere along the way, the reasons faded, but the charges stayed. Gas stations are sneaky that way too. I go in for fuel and come out with a drink, a snack, something warm because it's right there. $4, $6. Sometimes more if I'm tired and not paying attention. It never feels like shopping. It feels like a pit stop. The insight hit when I noticed how automatic my hands were in that place. If I did that 3 times a week, that's about $30. $120 a month, nearly $1,500 a year. Emotionally, that number felt heavier than it should have. It felt like paying a small tax for being worn down. I remember telling myself it was a little reward, something harmless. Sitting with the math, it felt more like background spending that had gotten comfortable being invisible. Credit cards made everything feel smoother, and for a long time, I liked that. Rewards, points, cashback, little signals that I was doing money the smart way. The insight crept in when I noticed how those perks softened my awareness. A $25 charge feels lighter when you know you're getting 50 cents back. It doesn't change the math much, but it changes the feeling. Over time, that feeling mattered. I could see how I'd spent more just because it felt strategic. Over a year, that mindset probably cost me hundreds more than the rewards ever gave back. Emotionally, that was uncomfortable to admit, not because the system tricked me, but because I went along with it, telling myself I was optimizing when I was mostly just spending with better vibes. Delivery fees felt different because they didn't register as spending on anything tangible. They felt like payments to keep the day moving. $5, $7, a service fee stacked on top of another fee. The food mattered less than the friction disappearing. The insight landed when I totaled just the fees, not the meals. During busy months, it was close to $200. That's $2,400 a year just to avoid leaving the house. Emotionally, that number sat heavy. It felt like I was buying quiet, buying stillness, buying one less decision. I remember telling myself it was about time, about energy. Seeing the total, it felt more like I'd put a price on not wanting to deal with things. Upgrades were everywhere once I started looking. Not big ones, tiny ones. The larger size, the faster shipping. The premium option because it was only a couple dollars more. Individually, they were forgettable. Collectively, they weren't. If I added an extra $3 to 5 purchases a day, that's $15. $450 a month, over $5,000 a year. Emotionally, that math stung in a quiet way. None of those upgrades changed my life. I barely remembered them. I remember telling myself I wasn't being cheap, that I was valuing my time. Sitting with the number, it felt more like a habit of avoiding mild discomfort that slowly became very expensive. Social spending had its own rhythm. Coffee runs, splitting checks, grabbing something because everyone else was. It never felt optional, but it never felt intentional either. The insight came when I noticed how rarely I remembered enjoying those moments versus just keeping pace. If I spent an extra $50 a week that way, that's over $2,000 a year. Emotionally, that realization felt awkward, like admitting I'd paid to blend in. I remember telling myself this was just what adulthood looked like, that it was normal. Sitting with the number, it felt less normal and more negotiated, like I'd been quietly agreeing to expenses I never really chose. Late night online shopping had a familiar feel. I'd be tired, half paying attention, scrolling while something played in the background. The purchases weren't dramatic. $20, $30, enough to feel like I'd done something. The insight hit when I noticed how quickly those items blended into my space once they arrived. Over a month, it was easily $200. Over a year, $2,400. Emotionally, that felt strange, like I'd been buying punctuation for the end of my days. I remember telling myself it was cheaper than bigger hobbies, that it was harmless. Looking back, it felt like money spent to create movement when I was mostly standing still. I started noticing how often I spent money to avoid explaining myself, ordering food instead of cooking because I didn't want to justify being tired, replacing something instead of fixing it because I didn't want the hassle. The insight was realizing that avoidance has a price. If that pattern cost me even $100 a month, that's $1,200 a year. Emotionally, that felt uncomfortably accurate. I remembered framing those choices as self-care. Sitting with the total, it felt more like self-avoidance, paid out slowly, month by month. There was also spending fueled by optimism, buying things for a version of myself that was more organized, more motivated, more consistent. Planners, apps, gear. The insight came when I noticed how rarely those purchases changed anything. If I spent $50 a month this way, that's $600 a year. Emotionally, that number felt quietly sad. I remembered believing the purchase was the first step, that it would push me into a better rhythm. Looking back, it felt like I'd outsourced belief to my credit card and hoped it would do the work. Fees almost felt designed to be forgotten. Bank fees, late fees, convenience fees, small enough to ignore, frequent enough to matter. The insight hit when I finally added them up. Maybe $40 a month, nearly $500 a year for nothing I could point to. Emotionally, that felt like paying for inattention. I remember telling myself it wasn't worth the energy to fight them. Sitting with the total, it felt like energy I'd spent anyway, just later, in annoyance and regret. I noticed how rarely I looked at my statements with curiosity. Usually it was judgment or avoidance. The insight was realizing how much judgment made me rush. Curiosity slowed me down. When I slowed down, patterns showed up that I'd been funding without noticing. Emotionally, that shift was uncomfortable because it removed easy excuses. I remembered blaming prices, timing, bad months. Sitting there longer with the numbers, the patterns felt quieter, more personal, and harder to dismiss. This is the part I didn't want to look at first. How much of my spending happened when I felt worn down? Not reckless, not emotional, just done. The insight was noticing how tired me spent differently than rested me. If that difference cost me $200 a month, that's $2,400 a year. Emotionally, that number felt heavy because it tied money directly to energy. I remember telling myself I'd deal with it later when life was calmer. Life didn't get calmer. The spending stayed. Memory started to feel like a filter. If I didn't remember the purchase, it didn't feel real. The insight was realizing how forgetting protected the habit. Emotionally, that was unsettling. I could see how I'd trained myself to skim past certain charges, almost instinctively. I remembered scrolling quickly, not because I was busy, but because I didn't want to feel whatever came next. Sitting with that, it felt less like laziness and more like quiet self-protection that had gotten expensive. There was a strange kind of grief in realizing how much money passed through my life without leaving a mark. Not because I was deprived, but because there was nothing to point to. If $5,000 a year disappeared this way for 10 years, that's $50,000 with no memory attached. Emotionally, that number felt unreal until it didn't. I remembered thinking my financial frustration came from not earning enough. Now it felt more like not noticing enough. I started thinking about how few of these things felt like decisions, they felt like defaults. The insight was realizing how powerful defaults are because they don't ask permission. Emotionally, that made me uneasy, not angry. I remembered telling myself adulthood was just expensive. Sitting with it longer, it felt more like adulthood was busy, and busyness had a bill that showed up quietly every month. There wasn't a dramatic turning point in any of this, just a growing awareness that money could leave without a goodbye. The insight was that awareness itself felt heavier than ignorance, at least at first. Emotionally, I stayed with that discomfort longer than I expected. I remembered preferring not to know. Now knowing felt like something I couldn't unsee, even if I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet. I did one last rough calculation, almost by reflex. Between food, fees, upgrades, and all the forgettable spending, it came out to around $800 a month, nearly $10,000 a year. I let that number sit there, not as a lesson, just as a weight. I imagined it as a stack of months, quiet and ordinary, adding up anyway. I didn't feel motivated. I didn't feel fixed. I just felt more awake than I had before. And if any of this felt familiar, I'd be curious what number shows up for you. No pressure, just, yeah,